A heart in peril. The crisp morning air barely touched the towering skyline of Los Angeles as the city awakened to another busy day. Among the waves of hurried commuters and distant honks, an elderly woman named Mrs. Helen Carter clutched her chest, her breath hitching in pain. At 68, she had learned to live with the occasional bouts of anxiety and discomfort, but this time, something was different. A tightness coiled around her ribs, pressing deeper with every breath. She wiped the sweat forming on her wrinkled brow and steadied herself against the kitchen counter. Maybe it was just another one of those episodes, something minor, something that would pass. But a deep, gnawing sensation in her gut told her otherwise. Mrs. Helen had been in and out of hospitals more times than she cared to count. She had sat in those long, sterile corridors under the harsh fluorescent lights, waiting for doctors who barely glanced in her direction before dismissing her concerns as stress-related. "It's nothing, just nerves," they had said. "You're just overthinking it." But today, she knew something was wrong. Summoning all her strength, she reached for the phone, her frail fingers trembling as she dialed for an ambulance. The hospital's cold welcome. The emergency room at St. Vincent Medical Center was a storm of chaos. The air reeked of antiseptic, mingling with the scent of coffee from exhausted nurses hurrying past. Phones rang incessantly, doctors shuffled between patients, and distressed families filled every corner of the waiting area. Mrs. Helen entered, gripping her chest. Each breath labored. Her eyes darted around, seeking help. A pang of helplessness washed over her as she realized that, despite her pain, no one was looking her way. To them, she was just another patient, one among many. She dragged herself to the front desk, where Nurse Stephanie, a woman in her early 40s with dark circles under her eyes, was typing furiously on her computer. Without lifting her head, she sighed. "Mrs. Helen, you again." The nurse's tone was indifferent, borderline exasperated. Helen winced. "Please, something's wrong. This time, it's different." "Aha," Stephanie muttered, barely paying attention. "Just have a seat. A doctor will see you when they're available." Helen clenched her fists. She wanted to argue, to plead for urgency, but she had done this before. She had heard the same words, seen the same dismissive expressions. The very act of speaking up exhausted her. She sank onto a plastic chair in the waiting area, pain clawing at her chest. Minutes stretched into an hour, then two. The sharpness intensified, her breaths growing more shallow. No one came. And then, just as her vision blurred, the hospital doors swung open. An unexpected guardian. Through the entrance strode Keanu Reeves, the world-renowned actor known for his humility and kindness. He had come to the hospital under private circumstances, visiting a close friend who had just undergone surgery. Dressed in a simple black hoodie and jeans, he exuded an unassuming presence, but to those who recognized him, he was an icon. As he walked past the waiting area, his keen eyes caught sight of Mrs. Helen. Something about the frail woman, hunched over in distress, made him pause. People were quick to notice him, whispering in hushed excitement, but Keanu's focus was on her. He moved closer, his expression shifting to concern. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked gently. Helen barely registered his voice. She was slipping into a daze, the pain too overwhelming. Keanu turned to the receptionist. "Has she been helped?" His voice was calm, but firm. Nurse Stephanie glanced up, her tired expression flickering with mild recognition. She's been waiting for a while. Doctors are busy." Keanu's gaze hardened. "She's struggling to breathe," he said, his voice laced with quiet intensity. "She needs to be seen now." Stephanie hesitated. There were rules, protocols, but this was Keanu Reeves. And more importantly, the elderly woman looked like she was on the verge of collapse. "Let me see what I can do," the nurse murmured, grabbing a chart. But it was already too late. Mrs. Helen slumped forward, her body convulsing. "Someone get a doctor," Keanu shouted, life hanging by a thread. Within seconds, the emergency team rushed in, wheeling Helen away on a stretcher. Keanu followed close behind, watching as nurses scrambled to stabilize her condition. Dr. Patel, a seasoned cardiologist, assessed her vitals, his face growing grim. "She's having a major cardiac event. We need to operate." Keanu clenched his jaw. He wasn't family. He had no say in medical procedures, but he couldn't just walk away. "Do whatever you need to," he said. Hours passed in agonizing silence. Keanu sat outside the operating room, his fingers laced together in contemplation. He thought of his own losses, the pain of watching loved ones suffer, and he felt an overwhelming urge to ensure Helen didn't become just another forgotten soul in a busy hospital. Finally, the doors swung open. Dr. Patel emerged, his surgical mask pulled down. "She's stable," he announced. "It was a close call, but she'll recover." Keanu exhaled in relief. He had barely known this woman for more than a fleeting moment, yet her life had suddenly meant something significant to him. A second chance. The next morning, Helen woke up in a private hospital room. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the sheets. She turned her head and gasped. Sitting beside her, reading a book, was Keanu Reeves. "You're awake," he said, closing the book. Helen blinked, still groggy. "Am I dreaming?" Keanu chuckled. "No, ma'am. You gave everyone quite a scare." Tears welled in her eyes as she pieced together what had happened. You saved me." "I just made sure they listened," he replied simply. Over the next hour, Helen shared her struggles, how she had felt invisible for years, how doctors had dismissed her, how loneliness had crept into her life like an unwelcome guest. Keanu listened intently, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he made her a promise. "You're not alone anymore, Mrs. Helen." And true to his word, he made sure of it. The ripple effect of kindness. The aftermath of a miracle. Mrs. Helen Carter lay in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind a blur of emotions. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been on the verge of death, ignored by a system that had failed her too many times. And now, she was alive, saved by none other than Keanu Reeves. The weight of the moment still hadn't fully settled in. Every breath she took felt like a gift, yet a lingering fear gnawed at the back of her mind. Would things really change? Would the world treat her any differently when she left the safety of this hospital room? Or would she go back to being invisible? She turned her head slowly, eyes widening as she saw Keanu sitting by her side again. He had fallen asleep in the chair, his head resting against the wall, arms crossed. The sight sent a strange warmth through her chest. He didn't have to be here. He didn't owe her anything. And yet he had stayed. Her frail fingers reached out, trembling slightly as she gently touched his arm. "Mr. Reeves." His eyes flickered open instantly, trained by years of working long hours on movie sets. He straightened up, rubbing his eyes before offering her a soft smile. "Hey, you're awake. How are you feeling?" Helen swallowed back the lump in her throat. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Keanu said, leaning forward slightly. "I just did what anyone should have done." Helen's lip quivered, but no one ever does. Keanu didn't argue. He knew she was right. Before he could respond, the door creaked open, and Dr. Patel walked in, his expression much lighter than the night before. "Mrs. Carter," he greeted, flipping through her chart. "You're one tough lady. That was a close call." Helen chuckled weakly. "I suppose I still have some fight left in me." Dr. Patel nodded, checking her vitals. "Your heart is strong, but we're going to keep you here for a few more days to monitor you. After that, we'll set you up with some outpatient care to make sure this doesn't happen again." Helen's smile faltered. Outpatient care. That meant going home. Alone. Back to the same lonely apartment where the silence was deafening. Keanu noticed the shift in her expression and made a mental note of it. Dr. Patel, oblivious to her distress, continued, "You're lucky, Mrs. Carter. If you had waited any longer, the outcome might have been very different. Helen turned to Keanu. It wasn't luck. Dr. Paddle smiled, understanding what she meant. No, I suppose it wasn't. Keanu's promise. Later that afternoon, Keanu and Helen sat together, watching the world outside the hospital window. You have family? Keanu asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Helen hesitated. Not really. My husband passed away years ago. I had a son, but, her voice cracked. He died in an accident when he was 25. Keanu's jaw tightened. He knew that pain all too well. I'm sorry. She shook her head. It was a long time ago. But ever since then, it's just been me. Keanu leaned back in his chair. That's not right. Helen let out a soft laugh. That's life, sweetheart. Doesn't have to be. She raised an eyebrow at him. What do you mean? Keanu exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't sure why he felt so invested in this woman's story, but he did. Maybe it was because he had lost so many people himself. Maybe it was because he had seen his own mother grow old without much support. Or maybe, just maybe, he was tired of watching good people be forgotten. You shouldn't have to go through this alone, he said. No one should. Helen smiled, though there was sadness behind it. That's a kind thought, dear, but what can you do? You have your own life. Keanu looked at her, his eyes dark with determination. Let's change that. She blinked. Change what? The way the world sees people like you. Helen stared at him in disbelief. What are you saying, Keanu? He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. I mean, let's make some noise. The world starts watching. 2 days later, a video surfaced on Keanu Reeves' official social media. It was a simple clip. No special effects, no music, just Keanu sitting in front of a camera. I want to tell you a story. A few days ago, I met a woman named Mrs. Helen Carter. She nearly died in a hospital waiting room. Not because there weren't doctors available, not because she didn't try to ask for help, but because no one took her seriously, because she was old. That's the world we live in. A world that forgets its elders. A world that treats them like they don't matter. But they do. Helen is someone's mother, someone's wife, someone who worked, sacrificed, and gave everything she had to the people around her. And yet, when she needed help the most, she was ignored. This needs to change. We need to start paying attention. We need to do better. The video ended there. No flashy graphics. Just Keanu's face, raw and real. Within hours, it went viral. Millions of people shared it. Celebrities reposted it. News outlets picked it up. Suddenly, the world was talking about the way hospitals, society, and even families treated the elderly. Hospitals were flooded with calls. People started checking in on their elderly neighbors. A nationwide discussion had begun. And in the middle of it all, Mrs. Helen sat in her hospital bed, watching it unfold on the tiny screen of her phone, tears streaming down her cheeks. She wasn't invisible anymore. The fight begins. Keanu's message wasn't just talk. He meant what he said. A week after Helen's release from the hospital, she received a phone call from his assistant. Mr. Reeves would like to invite you to an event. Event? She asked, bewildered. Yes, a fundraiser. He's starting a foundation to improve elderly care in hospitals. And you, Mrs. Carter, are the guest of honor. Helen nearly dropped the phone. She had spent years being ignored, cast aside. And now the world was listening. Now she had a voice that couldn't be silenced. An invitation that changed everything. Mrs. Helen Carter sat in her tiny apartment, staring at the invitation on the kitchen table. Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced the elegant lettering. A night for change. A fundraiser for elderly care reform. Hosted by Keanu Reeves. She still couldn't believe it. In just a few short weeks, her life had transformed from one of loneliness and neglect to the center of a national conversation. Keanu Reeves, the Keanu Reeves, had not only saved her life, but also given her a voice when no one else would. And now, he was asking her to stand beside him at an event that was already making headlines across the country. For decades, Helen had been ignored, dismissed, made to feel like a burden. Now suddenly, the world was paying attention. The thought both excited and terrified her. Was she really ready for this? A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, she was stunned to see Keanu himself standing there, dressed casually in jeans and a black blazer. He held 2 coffee cups, grinning like they were just old friends catching up. "Morning, Helen." She blinked. "Keanu, what on earth are you doing here?" He handed her a cup. "Thought you could use some coffee before the big event." Helen chuckled, stepping aside to let him in. "You're a strange man, Keanu Reeves. I get that a lot." He smirked, taking a seat at her small kitchen table. Helen followed, carefully sitting across from him. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. "Me being at the fundraiser." Keanu's expression turned serious. "Absolutely." She exhaled shakily. "I've never been in front of a crowd before. What if I mess up?" Keanu leaned forward. "Helen, you lived through losing a husband, losing a son, years of being ignored by the world, and nearly dying in a hospital waiting room. You didn't just survive, you fought. If anyone deserves to be heard, it's you." Helen swallowed back tears. For so many years, she had felt small, unimportant. But now, Keanu was looking at her like she mattered, like she was someone. She took a deep breath and nodded. "All right," she said. "Let's do this." A night that shook the nation. The venue was nothing short of spectacular, a grand ballroom in Los Angeles, adorned with soft golden lights, velvet drapes, and round tables covered in crisp white linen. The room buzzed with anticipation as high-profile guests arrived, celebrities, philanthropists, hospital administrators, and even government officials. But all eyes were on one person, Mrs. Helen Carter. When she stepped onto the red carpet in a simple but elegant navy blue dress, a gift from Keanu's team, cameras flashed, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Is that her? The woman from Keanu's video? She looks amazing." Helen gripped Keanu's arm tightly, her heart hammering. "This is insane." He chuckled. "Just wait until you get inside." The night was a whirlwind. A-list celebrities came up to introduce themselves. Politicians whispered about policy changes, and reporters eagerly snapped pictures. But the most powerful moment of the night came when Keanu took the stage. The room fell silent as he stood behind the podium, looking out at the sea of expectant faces. "A few weeks ago," he began, "I met a woman who changed my life." Helen froze. She didn't do it by being famous or powerful or wealthy. She did it by surviving, by being strong when the world tried to make her feel weak. And she reminded me of something I think too many of us forget. How we treat our elders says everything about who we are as a society. A murmur of agreement swept through the room. Keanu turned to the side, extending his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mrs. Helen Carter." A thunderous applause erupted as Helen, heart pounding, stepped up to the podium. For a moment, she stood frozen, overwhelmed by the lights, the cameras, the sheer enormity of the moment. Then she took a deep breath. "I was supposed to die in a hospital waiting room." The room fell into an eerie silence. I sat there, clutching my chest, in more pain than I had ever felt in my life. And nobody listened. Not because they were cruel, but because I was old. Because people like me are seen as expendable. A few gasps echoed in the crowd. But Keanu, he saw me. He didn't know me. He didn't know me anything, but he saw me. And because of that, I'm alive today. Helen's voice grew stronger. But I don't want this to just be my story. I want this to be a wake-up call. How many more Helens are out there, suffering in silence? How many elderly people have we failed simply because we were too busy, too distracted, or too indifferent to care? She took a steadying breath. We can't let this keep happening. The audience was on the edge of their seats. Helen locked eyes with Keanu, who gave her an encouraging nod. That's why tonight, we're not just raising money, we're demanding change. Hospitals must do better. Families must do better. We must do better. The room exploded in applause. Tears streamed down Helen's face as she stepped back from the microphone. For the first time in decades, she felt powerful. She felt heard. And that night, the world listened. The aftermath. A movement begins. Helen woke up the next morning to find her phone flooded with messages. Her speech had gone viral. News outlets were replaying it. Social media was ablaze with discussions about elderly neglect. A hashtag had even started trending. #COUrelders. But the biggest surprise came when Keanu called. "We did it, Helen," he said. The fundraiser pulled in over $25 million. Helen's heart nearly stopped. 25 million? Keanu laughed. And that's just the beginning. By the following week, things had spiraled into something far greater than either of them had anticipated. Hospitals across the country started implementing new elderly care policies. Celebrities pledged funds to improve assisted living facilities. Lawmakers introduced a new bill focused on elderly health care rights. And at the center of it all was Mrs. Helen Carter. No longer just another forgotten senior citizen. She was a fighter, a voice, a symbol of change, the price of change, a world watching. Mrs. Helen Carter never imagined that her life would become a headline. One day, she had been just another elderly woman struggling to be heard. The next, she was a national symbol of change. Her speech at Keanu Reeves' fundraiser had set off a tidal wave of conversations about elderly neglect, and now she couldn't walk down the street without someone stopping to thank her. At first, it was surreal. She had spent decades feeling invisible, sitting alone in her small apartment, watching the world move on without her. But now, people looked at her with respect. But with that attention came something she hadn't expected. Criticism. The backlash begins. One morning, Helen's phone rang. It was Keanu. "You might want to stay off the news for a bit," he warned. Helen frowned. "Why?" Keanu hesitated before sighing. "Not everyone's happy about what we're doing." Confused, Helen grabbed her tablet and opened the latest headlines. Is Keanu Reeves being used? Elderly woman's speech sparks debate. Hollywood's new cause. Genuine or publicity stunt? Hospitals push back against unrealistic elderly care demands. Helen's stomach twisted as she read the articles. Journalists were accusing her of being a prop. Hospital administrators were saying her story was exaggerated. Some people even called her entitled for expecting better care at her age. Her hands shook as she put the tablet down. She turned to Keanu, who was watching her through the video call. "I knew some people wouldn't like this, but I didn't think they'd go this far." Keanu nodded. "Change makes people uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean we stop." Helen took a deep breath. She had spent a lifetime staying silent, but she wasn't that woman anymore. She had a voice now, and she was going to use it. A bold response. Helen didn't stay quiet. That afternoon, she recorded a message from her living room and posted it online. "To anyone who thinks I'm exaggerating, let me ask you something. How many times have you walked past an elderly person struggling and ignored them? How many times have you dismissed an old man or woman because they talked too slow, walked too slow, or didn't understand technology? Do you really think this problem doesn't exist? I don't need Keanu Reeves to fight for me. I don't need Hollywood to make me famous. I need people to open their eyes." The video exploded. It was shared millions of times. Celebrities backed her up. Elderly people all over the country started sharing their own horror stories. Times they had been ignored, mistreated, or made to feel like they didn't matter. And suddenly, it wasn't just her fight anymore. It was everyone's. An invitation from the White House. A week after the video went viral, Helen received a call that left her speechless. "Mrs. Carter, this is Sarah Williams, a representative from the White House. The president would like to meet with you." Helen nearly dropped the phone. Keanu, who had been sitting beside her at the time, gave her a knowing smirk. Told you this was just the beginning. 2 days later, Helen found herself in a place she never thought she'd be, inside the Oval Office. She sat across from the president, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Cameras flashed as journalists documented the moment. The president smiled. "Mrs. Carter, your story has moved the entire nation, and I believe we have a responsibility to do something about it." Helen held her breath as he continued. "We're introducing the Elderly Care Protection Act, a bill that would increase hospital funding for senior care, implement stricter laws against patient neglect, and create new community programs to prevent isolation." Tears welled in Helen's eyes. She wasn't just a story anymore. She was changing laws. Keanu, standing in the corner of the room, gave her a small nod. She knew what it meant. We did this. Enemies in high places. But not everyone was happy. That evening, Helen received an anonymous letter at her hotel. It was short but chilling. "Stay in your lane. This isn't your fight." Helen's hands trembled as she read it. Keanu, who had just arrived for dinner, took one look at her face and knew something was wrong. "What is it?" She silently handed him the note. His expression darkened as he read it. "This is a threat," he muttered. Helen swallowed. "I don't care. I'm not stopping." Keanu exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but we need to be careful. The more attention we get, the more powerful people we're going to upset." Helen straightened. Let them be upset. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid anymore. A nation divided. Over the next month, the debate raged. Some hospitals started changing their policies immediately, embracing the new wave of awareness. Others fought back, claiming they didn't have the resources to make changes. Political leaders took sides, some supporting the Elderly Care Protection Act, others calling it unnecessary. Helen became a household name. Some people called her a hero. Others called her a troublemaker. One news station even aired a segment calling her the most dangerous grandmother in America. Helen couldn't help but laugh at that one. But the truth was, she wasn't doing this for fame or attention. She was doing it for the millions of elderly people who still suffered in silence. And no amount of criticism was going to stop her. A decision that would change everything. One evening, Helen received a call from an unexpected source. An older man with a familiar voice greeted her. "Mrs. Carter, this is Senator David Monroe." Helen frowned. She knew who he was, a powerful politician who had been vocal against her movement. "I'd like to meet with you," Monroe said. "In private." Helen hesitated. Keanu, who had been listening, leaned forward. "Be careful," he murmured. Helen nodded, gripping the phone tightly. "All right," she said. "Let's talk." What she didn't know was that this meeting would change everything. For better, or for worse. A deal with the devil. The meeting that could change everything. Mrs. Helen Carter sat at a polished wooden table in a high-rise office, the city skyline glittering behind her. Across from her sat Senator David Monroe, a powerful politician who had been vocal against her movement from the beginning. Keanu Reeves had insisted on coming with her, but Monroe had refused. "This is between me and Mrs. Carter," he'd said. Helen wasn't sure what she had expected from Monroe. Maybe a smug businessman, maybe a cold, calculating politician. But as she looked at him now, a man in his late 60s with tired eyes and a forced smile, she realized something. He wasn't just an enemy. He was afraid. The offer. Monroe leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "Mrs. Carter, let's cut to the chase. You've made quite the impact." Helen stayed silent. He sighed. "You're pushing for policies that hospitals claim they can't afford. You've forced lawmakers to take sides. The healthcare industry is in chaos because of you." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Good." Monroe's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Carter, you're fighting a war that you don't fully understand." Helen folded her arms. "Then explain it to me." Monroe hesitated. Then he pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Helen opened it, and her blood ran cold. Inside were hospital financial reports, government healthcare budgets, and memos from hospital executives. The documents revealed millions of dollars in funding cuts to elderly care programs, money that had been quietly rerouted to more profitable departments like cosmetic surgery and luxury hospital suites. It wasn't that hospitals couldn't afford better elderly care. They just chose not to. Helen's hands trembled as she closed the folder. Monroe exhaled, rubbing his temples. I agree that the system is broken. But if you keep pushing, it's going to collapse. We don't have the resources to fix this overnight. Helen stared at him. So what do you want from me? Monroe leaned forward. I want you to slow down. Helen narrowed her eyes. We can make small changes, Monroe continued. Gradual improvements. We introduce mild reforms. Keep the public happy, and the hospitals don't suffer financially. Helen felt a sickening anger rise in her chest. He wasn't asking her to fix the system. He was asking her to help cover it up. A choice that could change everything. Monroe studied her face. Look, Mrs. Carter, I know you're a good person, but I've been in politics long enough to know how these things work. If you push too hard, you'll make powerful enemies. Helen's heart pounded. I'm offering you a compromise, Monroe continued. I can get hospitals to increase elderly care funding by 10%, maybe even 15%. It's not perfect, but it's something. In return, you stop pushing for a complete overhaul. Helen swallowed hard. A part of her wanted to accept. 15% more funding could help thousands of elderly patients. But then she thought about all the others, the ones who would still be left behind. She had fought so hard to get to this moment, and now she had to decide. Would she settle for a small win, or would she risk everything for the real change people deserved? The answer that shocked the nation. Helen took a deep breath. Then she stood up. Monroe frowned. Mrs. Carter. She picked up the folder and tossed it back onto the table. You're afraid, Senator, she said quietly. Not for the hospitals, not for the budget, for yourself. Monroe's face darkened. You know the system is broken, she continued. But instead of fixing it, you want to cover it up so you can keep your seat in office. He didn't deny it. Helen straightened. I've spent too many years being silent. I won't start now. Monroe clenched his jaw. If you reject this deal, you're going to make enemies you can't handle. Helen smiled, a small, defiant smile. I've been ignored, dismissed, and underestimated my whole life. Do you really think I'm afraid of you? Monroe's expression darkened. You don't understand what's coming. Helen turned toward the door. I think you're the one who doesn't understand, she said over her shoulder. Because now, the whole world is watching. And with that, she walked away. The fallout. The moment Helen left the meeting, she exposed everything. She went live on social media and told the world about Monroe's offer. She showed the documents. She named names. She refused to be silenced. The backlash was immediate. Hospitals were forced to respond. Some executives tried to defend their actions, while others resigned in disgrace. Government officials were put under investigation for their role in elderly care funding cuts. The public was furious. Protests erupted across the country, demanding real reform. And Monroe, the man who had threatened her, his political career was in ruins. Helen had done something no one thought was possible. She had taken on the system, and won. But the fight wasn't over. The victory was huge. But it also put a target on Helen's back. She received anonymous threats, hate mail, messages telling her to stay out of politics. Keanu Reeves, who had been by her side through everything, sat with her in her apartment one evening. You're making history, he said. But I won't lie. It's going to get harder from here. Helen nodded. I know. He studied her face. Are you sure you want to keep going? Helen took a deep breath. She thought about all the elderly people who still needed her. She thought about the ones who didn't have a voice. Then she met Keanu's eyes and smiled. I'm just getting started. The storm that followed. The calm before the chaos. Mrs. Helen Carter sat by the window of her small apartment, sipping her tea as she watched the city lights flicker in the distance. It had been 6 weeks since she had exposed Senator Monroe and the corruption behind elderly care policies. 6 weeks since her name had been plastered across headlines, since she had taken on the system and won. But victories in politics and power were never simple. She had learned that the hard way. Keanu Reeves had warned her that pushing for change wouldn't just make enemies, it would make powerful enemies. And he had been right. The threats had started immediately. Anonymous letters, emails, even whispers of lawsuits claiming she was defaming hospitals and government institutions. But Helen didn't scare easily. She had spent her whole life being ignored. Now, the world was listening, and she wasn't about to let them forget. The first blow. It started small. Helen's bank account was frozen due to a clerical error. Then, her medical records mysteriously disappeared from the hospital database, causing confusion about her health insurance. Calls from interviewers and supporters suddenly stopped coming through, as if her number had been flagged or blocked. Keanu had been the first to notice the pattern. They're trying to shut you down, he said, pacing in her living room. Cutting off your resources, making your life difficult. Helen clenched her fists. I won't stop, Keanu. He stopped pacing and looked at her, admiration in his eyes. I know. But he also knew something she didn't. This was just the beginning. The smear campaign. The real attack came a week later. Helen woke up to a flood of messages on her phone. Texts, voicemails, news alerts. Confused, she opened the first article. The truth about Mrs. Helen Carter, a fraud. Exposed. The woman behind the elderly care scandal. Did she fake her hospital experience for publicity? Helen's blood ran cold. News outlets were suddenly doubting her story. Some anonymous sources claimed she was never in serious medical danger and had exaggerated her experience to gain attention. Even worse, one article suggested she had connections to a rival political party, painting her as a political pawn rather than a woman fighting for real change. Helen's hands shook as she scrolled through the comments. I knew it. Just another old lady looking for fame. Keanu Reeves got played. She's not a hero. She's a fraud. Hospitals have enough problems without people like her making things worse. Helen felt sick. She had expected resistance. But this was an outright attack on her character, her integrity, her entire life. And the worst part, people were believing it. Betrayed from within. Keanu arrived at her apartment within the hour. He looked furious. I called some people, he said, his jaw tight. This isn't just random backlash. Someone's orchestrating this. Helen swallowed hard. Monroe. Keanu hesitated. Maybe. But there's something worse. He pulled out his phone and showed her a leaked email that had just surfaced online. It was between a journalist and a close associate of Helen's. Someone who had been helping her fight for change. Someone she had trusted. Helen's heart nearly stopped as she read the name. Dr. Patel. The very doctor who had saved her in the hospital that night. The very man who had stood by her side in the fight for elderly care. He had betrayed her. The email exchange was damning. Dr. Patel had been feeding information to hospital executives, claiming that Helen had exaggerated her condition to gain media attention. That while she had been sick, it wasn't as critical as she claimed. He had sold her out. Helen clenched her fists. Why? Keanu sighed. Money, power, or maybe pressure. But either way, it's clear, they got to him. Helen's hands trembled. She had trusted Patel. She had believed in him. And now, he had become a pawn for the very people trying to destroy her. Fighting back. Helen had a choice. She could retreat, let the world turn against her, let the hospitals and politicians win. Or she could fight back. And she had already made her decision. The next morning, she went live on national television. The host, a well-known news anchor, was one of the few journalists still willing to hear her side. "Mrs. Carter," he began, "how do you respond to the claims that you exaggerated your illness for attention?" Helen looked straight into the camera. "I wish I had." The host blinked. "Excuse me." Helen's voice was steady. "I wish I had exaggerated. I wish I had never had to sit in that waiting room, begging for help. I wish I had never almost died because the system ignored me." The studio was silent. "But I did." She leaned forward. "And I am not the only one. If people want to believe I'm a liar, fine. But ask yourself this: why are so many elderly people coming forward now? Why are their stories exactly like mine?" The host shifted uncomfortably. "Well, because it's the truth." The cameras zoomed in as Helen's eyes darkened. "And I am not backing down." The counterattack. Helen's interview went viral. Again. Suddenly, the tide turned. People started fact-checking the smear campaign. Investigative journalists found evidence that hospital executives had paid to discredit her. More and more elderly patients came forward, sharing their own horror stories. Even Dr. Patel, the man who had betrayed her, was forced to resign when the truth came out. He had been pressured and bribed into lying. The people who had tried to silence Helen had only made her louder. And now, she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for an entire generation. A new threat. But just as Helen thought she had survived the worst, a mysterious letter arrived at her doorstep. It was typed. No return address. She hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single, chilling message. "Walk away. This is your last warning." Helen felt her stomach drop. This wasn't just politics anymore. This was a war. And someone was willing to do anything to stop her. The battle for the future. The threat that changed everything. Mrs. Helen Carter sat in her dimly lit apartment, the cryptic letter clenched tightly in her hands. "Walk away. This is your last warning." The words echoed in her mind like a relentless drumbeat. For weeks, she had endured threats, lies, and betrayals, all because she had dared to expose the truth about how society neglects the elderly. But this was different. This wasn't a smear campaign. It wasn't some corrupt senator trying to manipulate her. This was a direct warning. And whoever sent it was serious. Keanu's reaction. Helen wasn't alone when she found the letter. Keanu Reeves had been sitting in her living room, sipping coffee, when she had opened the envelope. She had seen the moment his expression darkened. Keanu was a man known for his calm demeanor, but as he read the message, something in his jaw tightened, a silent fury that rarely surfaced. "This isn't just intimidation," he murmured. "This is a threat." Helen forced herself to stay steady. "I know." He set the letter down carefully, looking at her. "Helen, we need to be smart about this. Whoever is behind this, they're getting desperate." Helen nodded, but she wasn't afraid. She was angry. "How do we fight back?" she asked. Keanu studied her for a moment, then reached for his phone. "First, we find out who sent this." And just like that, the battle had escalated. A dangerous investigation. Within 24 hours, Keanu had pulled every string he could. His private security team traced the letter's origin, but whoever had sent it was careful. It had been dropped off manually at the post office, with no fingerprints, no digital trail. But then, they found something. One of the security cameras outside Helen's apartment had captured a shadowy figure slipping the envelope into her mailbox. The footage wasn't clear, but there was one detail that stood out: a golden cufflink glinting in the dim streetlight. Helen and Keanu exchanged looks. It was a clue. And they both knew exactly where to start looking. A face-to-face confrontation. The next day, Helen and Keanu walked straight into Senator Monroe's office. The politician had barely looked up from his desk when Helen slammed the mysterious letter in front of him. "Do you recognize this?" she demanded. Monroe glanced at it, unfazed. "Should I?" Keanu folded his arms, watching him closely. Helen narrowed her eyes. "We know someone from your circle sent it." Monroe sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Mrs. Carter, you've caused quite a stir. People are upset." Keanu's voice was calm but firm. "Upset enough to threaten an old woman's life." Monroe's smirk faltered. For the first time, Helen saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. Not amusement. Fear. That was when she knew Monroe wasn't behind the threat. He was just as afraid as they were. The real enemy revealed. Helen pressed. "Who sent it, Monroe?" The senator hesitated, glancing at the closed office door. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "It's bigger than me." Helen's heart pounded. Monroe exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. "You think I run this game?" "I'm a politician, Helen. I work for them." Keanu frowned. "Them." Monroe's voice dropped even lower. "The people who actually control the hospitals, the healthcare giants, the ones making billions while elderly patients die in waiting rooms." Helen felt a chill crawl up her spine. She had been fighting the wrong enemy. It wasn't just Monroe. It was the entire healthcare industry, the billion-dollar corporations profiting from a broken system. And they had just declared war on her. The assassination attempt. That night, Helen couldn't sleep. She sat in her apartment, staring at the city beyond her window, thinking about the monsters she had just uncovered. She knew one thing for certain. They wouldn't stop until she did. And then, bang! The shattering of glass sent her instincts into overdrive. A bullet tore through her window, missing her by inches. Helen ducked, her heart slamming against her ribs. Someone was trying to kill her. Keanu's plan. Within minutes, Keanu was there. His security team swept the building, but the shooter had vanished into the night. Helen sat in shock as Keanu crouched beside her, checking her for injuries. "You're coming with me," he said. Helen blinked. "What?" Keanu wasn't asking. "You're not safe here anymore. We need to be smart." Helen exhaled shakily. "So what do we do?" Keanu's eyes were fierce. "We take them down." The final move. Helen was done playing defense. The next morning, she called a press conference. The world watched as she exposed everything, not just corrupt politicians, but the healthcare executives behind them. She named names. She showed documents proving how hospitals had cut elderly care funding while inflating profits. She exposed the bribes, the secret deals, the cover-ups. And then she held up the letter that had threatened her life. "I will not be silenced," she declared, her voice unwavering. "Not by politicians, not by billionaires, not by anyone." The audience erupted. #JusticeForElders began trending worldwide. The FBI launched an investigation into corruption in the healthcare industry. And the people who would try to kill her, they had just lost everything. The legacy of Helen Carter. Helen never wanted to be a hero. She had just wanted a doctor to listen to her. But by refusing to be ignored, she had done something bigger than she had ever imagined. She had changed the system. And as she sat beside Keanu Reeves, watching the world react, she realized something. She had never been alone. Because millions of people, old and young, had been waiting for someone to say what they had been afraid to say. And now, they weren't afraid anymore. Helen had won, not just for herself, but for every forgotten voice, for every elderly person who had ever been made to feel invisible, for the future, and the world would never forget her name.